Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toms Rostoks, and I'm Associate Professor at the University of Latvia and Senior Researcher at the Center for Security and Strategic Research at the National Defense Academy of Latvia. And today I have the pleasure to interview James Apaturai. I hope I did not mispronounce too much your surname. James is Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. And obviously, we'll be discussing these emerging security threats and challenges for the next 25 minutes or so. And I know that many of our listeners, many in our audience, they already must know what at least some of these emergent threats are about. But at the same time, there seem to be quite a few of them. They've been called in different ways. Different terminology has been used. And they've been around for a while, so some of them are no longer kind of emerging, perhaps they've already emerged, right? So can you talk a little bit about these emerging security threats and how NATO could address them?
Sure, and first, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and also to talk about these issues, because I think most people around the alliance and outside of NATO understand the sort of traditional roles that NATO has played over the decades. Collective defense, heavy metal, force-on-force defense, or the operational roles that NATO has played around the world or in other parts of the world, and our partnerships, the sort of cooperative security element of what NATO has done for so many years. What we have over the past few years started to come to grips with is, I think you're quite right to ask the question, emerging or emerged security challenges. And they're not totally unrelated to the other things that NATO does, but they are growing in certainly level of concern, growing in level of impact, growing in level of investment. So it's everybody's definition, everyone's got their own definition of what's included, but let me give you an example from my own perspective, because just 6 weeks ago I started in this new role, and then maybe it's worth laying out what the different areas are under my responsibility or in the responsibility of my division, because that's one way of looking at it. So one of those, and one of the most prominent, is innovation, or what you might call emerging and disruptive technology. So what does that mean? It means artificial intelligence, it means big data, it means autonomous weapons, hypersonics, what's going on in space. So there's a whole innovation aspect to this. And just to say a couple of words on that, I'm sure we can discuss it more in detail. But the bottom line is we have to maintain our edge in this area, including because countries that are less friendly towards us are investing very heavily in these areas. And that doesn't mean they necessarily pose a direct military threat to us. But there is potentially a military threat. There is also a more systemic threat about governance, about who dominates in these fields, which affect the security of our populations. So, I say, and we say, to maintain our edge. And in some areas, we do have an edge. To be very honest, I sometimes wonder whether in other areas related to this innovation aspect, we don't have it anymore, and we need to get it back. So that's one aspect. A second one, which is very much linked to that, is, of course, cybersecurity. And here, I think what you said about emerging versus emerged is pretty clear. This is clearly an emerged security challenge. But it evolves very, very quickly. And for example, what we see more and more is what is called ransomware attacks. So attacks by private groups or private groups that have implicit support from nations are taking hostage major infrastructure, like the pipelines in the eastern United States, but the United States just revealed that there were major attacks across their infrastructure. Yesterday, they just announced it again. This is happening all the time. Hospitals, etc. So cybersecurity is a second very, very important element of our, or another emerging security challenge. Then something which relates very much to what we've been talking about here at the conference, which is the security implications of climate change. And they are growing, and they're growing pretty fast. So what do I mean? I mean, for example, that there will be wars over resources. There will be mass movement of populations. Our coasts are increasingly going to be underwater, and that has great implications, not just for military facilities, but for people, because most people live near water. So what's going to happen? And what are the security implications of all of that? Then from a more military point of view, of course, our militaries are going to have to participate in responding to disasters, and they're going to have to operate in extreme weather, like extreme heat. So that's a third emerging security challenge. Let me give you a fourth, and then I'll stop. And it's what we call hybrid. So this is also going to be discussed here extensively at the conference. But what we call hybrid means that a state, in this case, an adversarial state, uses all the tools of state power in a coordinated way to achieve its strategic aims. And when I say state power, I don't just mean military state power, but cyber attacks, disinformation, energy cutoffs, or, as is being experienced in this region, migrants are being weaponized, but all for specific strategic aims. And according to well-developed strategies, often linked to military tools. So we need to get better at seeing what the patterns are, anticipating what they are, and responding, both in terms of increased resilience, but also in terms of imposing costs to deter future attacks. So these are just a few examples of what it is that we're dealing with, and I hope that that's enough to at least begin to answer the question.
Yes, thank you for the answer. Earlier today during the conference, Mark Leonard from European Council on Foreign Relations mentioned that in Europe we've been doing things at our own pace, but it seems that these security challenges, these emerging ones, they move at a higher pace, at a faster pace. Do you think that there is a way for NATO member states to kind of react more swiftly? And has NATO moved beyond, let's say, consulting and discussing these new security threats and kind of moving into more tangible policies that and developing instruments, because NATO prides itself upon being an alliance that does things, that has capabilities. So when it comes to these new emerging threats, has NATO moved beyond this discussion phase?
So absolutely. And actually, I'll say very honestly, arriving in my new division, I was really gratified to see that in all of these areas, there are substantial new policy foundations and actions being taken. But let me give you a concrete example, because I really agree with you that we need to operate faster and in new ways. And this is very much the discussion I've been just having in the last couple of days. And the example I want to give is with regard to emerging and disruptive technologies. So we have a gap compared to other countries. And one of the gaps that we have is that traditional defense industry works well with the government. I don't have a particular issue with that. It can always be better, but it works. But where we have a gap is connecting startups and dual-use technologies to the world of defense requirements. The startups in general in the West don't think about defense requirements. They aren't well-versed in how to protect what they have against acquisition by others. There's often a financing gap because they need funds quickly, and often there's, for example, a Chinese company with a big check that's ready to provide funding for them. So we are not moving as quickly as we can in adapting dual-use technologies to defense requirements at the pace that others are. And as a result, if we keep going like this, we're going to get left behind. And the traditional way that we do business, which is very slow, setting requirements, waiting till those requirements are set, then going to the companies, then waiting 3 or 4 years, it's not going to work. We need to engage with these communities. We need to guide them fast. We need to give them rapid contracts. We need to adjust quickly on the fly, very rare in defense contracting, and we need to get those dual-use technologies, where they are useful for us, quickly into the hands of our operators and adopting new technologies fast. So it's disruptive in the way that NATO does business. So that's the imperative and the logic, and we're acting on it. So we're putting in place something we call Diana, that's our acronym for it. But in essence, it's going to be a network of test centers, accelerator networks, bringing together startups with defense requirements, with some trusted funding to get this thing moving in the right direction. But it is not easy to get it moving, because while everyone recognizes the importance of doing it, and everyone recognizes that it needs to be done fast, we haven't had the procedures in place. So we're getting there, and I think you'll see at the Defense Ministerial next week, concrete achievement in getting this thing done. So yes, the answer is we are acting on it, but you're also right, it's really hard.
Then a follow-up question on this would be that NATO, as this traditional defense alliance, moves beyond its traditional role. So you have to work with other actors. Obviously, you have to work more closely with the EU, but then you have to work also with the private sector, with business companies. So is it easy to work with them?
So let me put it this way. I think when it comes to the European Union, cooperation with the EU in the area, for example, of innovation, has been and remains pretty good. When we have political complications between NATO and the European Union, which anyone who follows the two organizations will be familiar with, but there is clearly a synergy, and we're making sure that as we design this disruptive way forward in innovation, we're designing it with the EU's own systems in mind so that they are coherent, potentially complementary. Like very specifically, we are doing this. So I think that actually in the case of the European Union, it's okay. With the private sector, we're just getting going. I mean, there has been, I think, over the past decade or so, and in particular in some companies, a reluctance on some of the staff to engage too much with the defense sector. And you know, we have to contrast this with, for example, the Chinese, what's called civil-military fusion, where by law, every country, every company has to make available dual-use technologies to the People's Liberation Army of China. And by law, every country that processes data has to make that data available to the Chinese government. So we're really in a very different position. And while we want and are designing the ethical use of these technologies, and we'll make that public as well, we also can't get too far behind, which means engaging with these communities. So some companies are very comfortable working with the defense establishment. Others are just unfamiliar with us. And we need an active program to get out there and meet with them, explain what our requirements are, but also warn them about keeping their technology secure. Even if they don't work with us, not to let them leach out elsewhere unintentionally. So there's a whole education program that needs to happen. Many countries do it. Germany does it. My own country, Canada, does it. So there's an education aspect of that. But then the final point I would make is, and this is speaking very personally, I think we do need to be more vocal in making the point that there is a certain amount of strategic competition going on between the democratic community and the non-democratic community. And from my point of view, the companies that are based in the democratic world need to step up and not only think about paychecks, also think about the freedom of information, the standards of democracy and human rights, which we all understand now tech can support or repress. And it can repress it through the use of facial recognition technology and artificial intelligence and cameras everywhere. And feeding that is not a good idea. So I hope that we can contribute to a dialogue with the private sector that also brings them on board, not just for money, but in the context of strategic competition.
Next year, NATO will probably adopt the new strategic concept. So what place for these emerging threats and disruptive technologies you see in that concept?
So that's a great question, and we're just starting to develop it. Personally, and this is not self-serving, I hope for my new job, but I actually really do expect that the emerging security challenges will certainly play a much more prominent role than they did in the previous one, but that was 10 years ago. And I think more prominently, even in terms of proportion with the other roles. And I'm quite confident that NATO's three core tasks will be prominently in the new strategic concept as well. Collective defense, our operations, our partnerships, cooperative security, these are primordial for the alliance. Resilience runs through all of those. It runs very much through the emerging and disruptive technologies front in particular, but more broadly as well. So it's hard to say how the balance will come out, but it will be much more prominent. I also expect climate and the security implications of climate change to be prominently in the strategic concept. It is now, I think, everywhere. The understanding that this is a challenge we all have to face has become mainstreamed. I know the Secretary General is committed to this issue personally, also because he's had a past in the climate role, but because he obviously recognizes that NATO needs to be a world leader in three areas. One is in assessing the security implications of climate change. So we need to analyze what's happening, but also what's going to happen and how to deal with it. Second, in adapting to it, so adapting our forces, what they do and how they do it. And then third, NATO also has to contribute towards net zero in 2050. So we have to find a way to measure the carbon emissions of the entire NATO ecosystem and then see how we can start to bring it down. So in all of those areas, I think you'll see the summit will recognize emerging security challenges much, much more prominently than in the past.
Yes, discussions on climate change have really evolved over the past 15 to 20 years. I think back then people thought that, well, towards the end of the 21st century, we'll see some real climate change impact, while we're seeing it practically every year on grand scale in very damaging ways. So this is a different world in a way, in that sense. But at the end of this discussion, I'd like to ask you a question about something that might be important for young people, students, young professionals who are at the start of their career. In terms of knowledge and skill set that they might find useful. You've had a long and distinguished career at NATO. Having been at NATO for, I think, something like 20 years, what could you suggest to the younger part of our audience?
Well, that's a great question, and I now recognize how long I've been there. I would say two things. One is with regard to what we've been talking about. We are now hiring on a constant basis, of course, at NATO. And in these areas of emerging challenges, we have huge requirements. For example, when it comes to expertise on artificial intelligence, when it comes to expertise on big data exploitation, these are areas where it's very, very difficult to find enough trained people. And let me be very honest, enough trained people who are willing to work for a NATO salary, because I had a conversation with the head of a very, very big Canadian tech firm. This was before I took this job. And he said, yeah, James, that's great, but anyone you can hire, I can pay them 10 times the salary. And that's a reality. So we need people who are not just trained, but who are committed to the larger issue. NATO doesn't pay that badly. But I would certainly say that these areas of more technical expertise are in huge demand also for NATO. But the second thing I would say is, and this is much more related to the broader issue of working in NATO, and I think in diplomacy more broadly, being able to write clearly, succinctly, politically to the point is actually a skill you train for. And I can see from different countries whether or not they train their young people for that when I see the results that we get from job applications. But actually in any field, being able to analyze and write clearly is something which I would certainly recommend that colleagues train for. And then if you do want to get into a job in diplomacy, I'll give you just my own experience. I did a double major, as we say in Canada, so I studied two things, political science and history. And what I expected was that the political science would be very useful and the history would be a nice thing. In fact, my experience is the history we use every single day, or I do, because actually everything is about what came before. And when it comes to understanding any country, you have to understand what came before. And that has been extremely useful. The political science theories that I spent 4 years learning have almost never proven to be useful, so I just leave that to colleagues. But certainly when it comes now much more concretely to getting a job, certainly in the division where I work now, the technical capabilities relating to emerging and disruptive technologies, understanding them and putting them into a political context, that's something we need very much, and I'm 100% sure we're going to need it again. And let me add also expertise on climate. This is a technical issue. It is not just a political issue. We have expertise on this, which we need more of.
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, although I thought I would almost faint when you said that political science theories weren't that
so
useful.
sorry.
having a PhD in political science.
Oh no!
I almost fell off the chair.
Yeah, but I have a master's too.
Well, in any case, thank you so much for this conversation, and I suppose that we'll hear a lot more about emerging technologies and disruptions in the coming years as well, and hopefully NATO will come up with means how to not just to survive, but also to thrive in this competitive international environment. So thank you.
Thank you very much.